This letter was never delivered. It was found in a kiln in the ruins of Ugarit, a city on the coast of modern Syria, being fired for delivery when the city was destroyed. The messenger never left. The recipient never read it. The civilization that produced it was gone within months of this letter being written. And here is the thing that should disturb you most about this story. Ugarit was not alone. Within 50 years of that letter being written, every major civilization on this map had either completely collapsed or been permanently crippled. The Mycenaean Greeks, gone. The Hittite Empire, gone. Ugarit, gone. The Levantine city-states, gone. Egypt, surviving, barely, a shadow of what it had been. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse, the greatest civilizational catastrophe in human history. A disaster so complete, so total, so devastating, that it set human civilization back by 500 years, and we still don't fully know what caused it. Before we can understand what was lost, we need to understand what actually existed, because the world that collapsed in 1200 BC was not a collection of primitive kingdoms. It was something far more extraordinary. The late Bronze Age world was the first genuinely international system in human history. The great kings maintained diplomatic correspondence across thousands of miles, addressing each other as equals, exchanging daughters in marriage, negotiating trade agreements, managing a shared economic system of extraordinary complexity. The Uluburun shipwreck gives us the most direct window into this world. Its cargo came from at least 7 different cultures. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, tin ingots, probably from Afghanistan 3,000 miles away, ebony from sub-Saharan Africa, glass from Egypt, a scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti. 1 ship, 7 cultures, 3,000 miles of supply chain. This was not primitive trade. This was a globalized Bronze Age economy, and maintaining this system required something no individual civilization could produce alone. The Bronze Age world ran on bronze, and bronze requires 2 metals, copper and tin, that almost never occur naturally in the same place. The entire Bronze Age economy was therefore dependent on supply chains spanning thousands of miles, chains that required political stability, maintained trade routes, and functioning diplomatic relationships between dozens of kingdoms and city-states. When that system broke, it broke everything. For a century, archaeologists have been trying to answer the same question: what caused the Bronze Age collapse? And for a century, the honest answer has been, we don't fully know. There are 5 major theories. Each has real evidence behind it. Each explains part of what happened, none explains all of it. Theory 1. The Sea Peoples. The Egyptian records of Ramesses III describe waves of migrating peoples from the sea and from the north, destroying every civilization in their path before reaching Egypt. These sea peoples, the Peliset, the Chika, the Shekelesh, moved in organized migrations with their families and belongings, destroying the Hittites, Ugarit, and the Levantine city-states. But here is the problem. If entire peoples were migrating with their families and possessions, if they were not raiders but refugees, then something had already destroyed their own homes before they destroyed anyone else's. The sea peoples were not a cause, they may have been a symptom. Theory 2. Drought. Paleoclimatological evidence from across the eastern Mediterranean shows something compelling. Beginning around 1200 BC, a prolonged drought struck the entire region simultaneously. Pollen records show dramatic reductions in tree cover. Isotope analysis shows rainfall declining sharply. Archaeological evidence shows shrinking grain surpluses. A letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus asks desperately for grain. He describes famine. His people are dying. He has run out of food. This letter was written approximately 15 years before Ugarit's final destruction. The drought came first. Theory 3. Internal rebellion. The Bronze Age palace economies were extractive systems of extraordinary efficiency. The palace controlled the surplus. The palace distributed resources. The palace determined who received what. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 1200 BC, the gap between palace elites and agricultural labourers had become extreme. Famine, in a system like this, does not affect everyone equally. It affects the people at the bottom first, and when the people at the bottom have nothing left to lose, Theory 4, systemic trade disruption. Remember what we said about tin. The Bronze Age ran on bronze. Bronze requires copper and tin together. The tin supply chains were the longest, most fragile elements of the entire Bronze Age economy. If something disrupted the tin supply, migration, drought, political instability and source regions, The entire downstream economy felt it within years. No tin, no bronze, no weapons, no army, no security, no trade. A cascade of failure from a single point of disruption. Theory 5. Earthquakes. A series of major earthquakes appears to have struck the eastern Mediterranean between approximately 1225 and 1175 BC. Archaeological destruction layers at several sites show walls fallen inward, artifacts undisturbed by looting, the physical signature of instantaneous seismic destruction rather than gradual abandonment. And here is the conclusion that the evidence taken together demands. All 5 of these things happened simultaneously, and that is the answer. Not one cause, not even a primary cause with secondary factors, but a convergence of stresses, climate, migration, supply disruption, social inequality, seismic damage, that hit an interconnected, interdependent civilizational system at the same moment and overwhelmed its capacity to absorb any single one of them, let alone all of them together. The collapse did not happen overnight. It happened over approximately 50 years, roughly 1200 to 1150 BC. But in historical terms, 50 years is overnight. Mycenae, the palace that gave its name to an entire civilization, the city of Agamemnon in Greek mythology, the center of the Mycenaean palace economy that had dominated Greece for 3 centuries, destroyed around 1200 to 1150 BC. The final Linear B tablets from Mycenae, the administrative records baked hard in the fire that destroyed the palace, record emergency military preparations, coastal watchers being stationed, extra rowers being called up. And then the tablets stop, because the palace burned, and no one rebuilt it. Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, the great power that had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, signed history's first known peace treaty with Rameses II, and controlled Anatolia for centuries. Around 1180 BC, Hattusa was burned. The massive city walls were abandoned, the tablets were left in the archives, the temples were left standing, the city was simply left, not destroyed in a final battle, not looted systematically, the people left, and no one came back. Ugarit, the letter we opened with, the scribe writing in the kiln, the ships that were seen, the villages that burned. Around 1185 to 1175 BC, Ugarit was attacked and burned. Bodies were found in the destruction layer that were never buried. The people who survived had no time, or no one left, to perform the burial rites. The city was never rebuilt, a city that had been continuously occupied for over 5,000 years, abandoned in a single generation, city by city, kingdom by kingdom. The lights of the ancient world went out, and here is the most haunting part of the entire story. We have almost no first-person accounts of what it felt like to live through it. After the Bronze Age collapse, Greece entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages. The name is not metaphorical. The population of Greece declined by approximately 75 to 90%. Writing, which the Mycenaean palace scribes had used to manage their complex economies, was forgotten so completely that when the Greeks reinvented literacy several centuries later, they had to borrow an entirely different writing system from the Phoenicians. Long-distance trade effectively ceased. A population loss of 75 to 90% is not a historical footnote. It is one of the worst demographic catastrophes in the history of our species. The Hittite Empire was so completely destroyed that modern historians did not know it had existed until the 19th century. An empire that had fought Egypt to a standstill, that had controlled Anatolia for centuries, that had produced a legal code and literary tradition of genuine sophistication. Forgotten for 3,000 years. The recovery took approximately 500 years. 5 centuries of reduced population, lost knowledge, abandoned cities, simplified economies, and the slow, painful reconstruction of the social and political complexity that the Bronze Age had achieved. And here is what those 500 years produced on the other side. Classical Greece, the Phoenician alphabet, the ancestor of every Western writing system, iron tools and weapons, cheaper, more widely available than bronze, accessible to people who had been excluded from the Bronze Age economy by scarcity and cost. The collapse of the Bronze Age palace economies, the most devastating civilizational catastrophe in human history, accidentally created the conditions for a more accessible, more distributed, more democratic world than the one it destroyed. That is not a comfort. It is a complication, and complications are what real history is made of. Here is the question that haunts the Bronze Age collapse more than any other. The title of this documentary asks it directly. Why did nobody notice? They did notice. Of course they noticed. The letters from Ugarit, desperate, urgent, aware that something catastrophic was happening, prove that people noticed. What they could not notice was the scale. The king of Ugarit, who wrote that final letter, the one found unfired in the kiln, knew that his cities were burning. He knew that enemy ships had come. He knew that people were dying. What he could not know, what no single person in the ancient world could know, was that the same thing was happening simultaneously in Greece, in Anatolia, in Cyprus, and along the entire Levantine coast. He thought he was experiencing a local catastrophe. He was experiencing the end of the world he knew. And those are two different things. This is what historians mean when they talk about systemic collapse. Not a single dramatic event that everyone can see and respond to, but a cascade of failures, each one individually manageable, each one apparently local, each one connected to all the others by threads of trade, diplomacy, and supply chain that the people living inside the system cannot fully see, that overwhelms the system's capacity to recover before it can recognize what is happening. The Bronze Age world was more interconnected, more mutually dependent, more globally integrated than any civilization that had come before it. And that interconnection, the very thing that had made it wealthy and sophisticated and powerful, was also what made its collapse total. When the tin supply was disrupted, bronze production fell. When bronze production fell, armies could not be re-equipped. When armies could not be re-equipped, trade routes could not be protected. When trade routes failed, food could not move from surplus to famine regions. When the famine spread, social breakdown followed. When social breakdown produced migration, pressure on surviving states increased. When pressure on weakened states increased, they fell too. Each step looked manageable. Together they were not. Not everything was lost. The Phoenician city-states survived, protected perhaps by their specific geography, coastal cities that could trade and negotiate with whoever came, rather than being tied to the palace economies that collapsed around them. And from the Phoenicians came the alphabet. Not Linear B, the complicated syllabic script of the Bronze Age palace administrators, which died with the palaces that needed it. A simpler system, 22 consonant signs, learnable by anyone. The Phoenician alphabet eventually became the Greek alphabet. The Greek alphabet became the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet is what you're reading right now. The Bronze Age collapse killed an interconnected world of palace economies. It accidentally gave birth to the conditions that produced democracy, the alphabet, iron tools, and the world that eventually became ours. And in communities across the eastern Mediterranean, in isolated valleys, in coastal villages, in the minds of the few scribes and craftspeople who survived, knowledge persisted. Not in palace archives, not in bureaucratic records, in people, in the things that people taught their children because they knew those things mattered, even when the civilization that had valued that knowledge was gone. We began with a letter that was never delivered, a scribe writing in a kiln describing burning cities and enemy ships, trying to reach someone who could help, and never knowing that there was no one left to help. The Bronze Age collapse should be the most famous event in ancient history. It is not. It is barely taught in schools. It is far less discussed than the fall of Rome, which happened 1,200 years later and killed a single empire, not an entire civilizational system. Perhaps because it is too uncomfortable, because the Bronze Age collapse was caused not by one empire's failures, but by the specific vulnerability of a system that was interconnected, efficient and globally integrated. A system where the disruption of a critical input cascades through every connected element. A system where efficiency has been optimized at the cost of redundancy, where everyone depends on everyone else, where a disruption in one region becomes, through the logic of interconnection, a crisis everywhere. The Bronze Age world was the most sophisticated, most interconnected, most globally integrated civilization in human history up to that point. And it fell in 50 years to a convergence of stresses that its sophistication had left it uniquely vulnerable to. The scribe in Ugarit did not know he was writing the end of an age. He thought he was writing an urgent letter about a local crisis. He was, and it was also the end of an age. Both things were true. Both things can be true simultaneously. The ancient world ended on a night that looked To everyone living through it, like a crisis they would eventually manage, it was not. Civilizations rarely end with a sound. They end with a silence that starts in one place and spreads until the people who should have noticed are too busy managing their own local crisis to understand what the silence means. The letter was never delivered.